And hello YouTube, this is Thomas Judge back once again with another video in my retro emulation journey. Today we're going to be talking about backward compatibility and more specifically how backward compatibility is sometimes a lie and is definitely not all it's cracked up to be. As ever, this guide is a guide as to how I learnt how to emulate retro video games. It's not going to be too much of a technical deep dive. And in that sense, this is very much a record of how I learnt how to do it. So this is very much all about fucking around, finding out, and just other stuff that I learned that, to be honest, wasn't really well documented or well explained elsewhere on the internet. I had to kind of put together a lot of information to understand what I've understood today. So that's what this guide is. That's what we're going to be talking about today in a kind of a generic high level kind of way. And of course, none of these videos, none of this guide will be providing links to any ROMs whatsoever under any circumstances. So with no further ado, let's jump right into it. Backward compatibility. Backward compatibility is awesome. The idea that newer hardware can play games from older generations is fantastic. And it's great if backward compatibility is literally what it says on the tin, which is that you have an older device, you stick in an you have a newer device, you stick in an older bit of software on a physical media like a CD or a DVD or a cartridge, and it plays perfectly. However, that's not actually necessarily the case. And in a lot of cases, that doesn't actually work. And when it does actually work, it's not actually going to work forever. So I'm going to keep this just down to the facts for this video. In a few days or a few weeks' time, we're going to be looking at a video talking about backlog anxiety and how to handle backlog anxiety, especially in the retro space. And then this series is going to end with a video just talking about the future of gaming and my own kind of approach to gaming. Spoiler warning, I'm essentially dropping out of the video game. But we'll cover that all in due course. Today I want to talk about the technicality of how emulation works, just so you know. And above all, anything that I say here that's an opinion is my own opinion. All I want to do is give you the information and you can decide how you really want to react to it. First things first, let's talk about hardware emulation. Hardware emulation is when you've got a bit of hardware and basically you get out of the box, you plug it into, for example, your TV, you switch on the power, and you can put in an old bit of media, physical media, and it will play on it. So, for example, the PS2 can play PS1 discs. The PS3 can play PS1 discs. All versions of the PS3 can play PS1 discs. That's fine. So there you are, straightforward, standard hardware emulation. The PS5 can play PS4 discs literally just off the disc. Just put the disc in, it'll play it. Yeah, there'll be patches and DLC and stuff, but basically it's hardware side emulation. And some PS3s, the original, what they call the FAT version, can actually play PS2 games from the hardware. You just put in the PS2 game and it plays. Looking at Nintendo, I can't see it here, but in terms of handhelds, the Nintendo DS plays Game Boy Advance games. You just plug them into the bottom on the original Nintendo DS or on the DS Lite. But then the DSi and the sort of the later version of the DS and the 3DS don't do that. But the original Nintendo DS does play Game Boy Advance games. Looking at these consoles, the Wii played GameCube games. You could literally slide in a GameCube disc physically and it would physically play it off the disc. And the Wii U physically played Wii games off the hardware. You just slid in a Wii disc and it would play the Wii game. So the Wii U was also backwardly compatible. And of course, the Game Boy and the Game Boy Color, again not shown here, would play on the Game Boy Advance. You just plug them in like a normal cartridge and they work fine. And that's on all models of Game Boy Advance. This is hardware emulation. Looking at Xbox, for example, we've got the Xbox One, and those games play on the Xbox Series. Literally just slide in the disc, they play, job done. Hardware side emulation, the Xbox Series is really kind of an Xbox One X Pro, really, when you think about it. And that's fine. Hardware side emulation, those things are all good. They're not perfect and they're not bulletproof forever, but we'll talk about that in a second. But that's hardware side emulation. However, a lot of backward compatibility is software emulation. So looking, for example, at the Xbox ecosystem, the Xbox 360 does play original OG Xbox games from the hardware. You slide in the disc and it plays it. But that is only possible if your Xbox 360 has the most recent firmware, the most recent operating system. If you got a brand new Xbox 360 out of the box and you didn't update it online, then you wouldn't be able to play your OG Xbox games like Halo or Ultimate Spider-Man or whatever you might want to play. So in that sense, whilst it does play from the hardware, it relies on the right software being installed. And at any point, Xbox can switch off that software in the cloud for you to download. So actually, there might be a future where you have your Xbox 360, you slide in your original Xbox game, and it won't play because it hasn't been able to download the right system software. Unlikely, but it's true, and it's important in terms of what we're about to talk about. The Xbox One and the Xbox Series play Xbox 360 and original Xbox games from what's called server-side emulation. In other words, you slide the disc in for an Xbox 360 game like Assassin's Creed, and it will download an Xbox Series version of that game. It doesn't play it off the disc. The disc acts like a license key or like a Nintendo game key card or something like that. That's how Xbox emulation works now that we're looking at the Series X. And the Xbox One as well was the same. If you slid in a 360 game that were backwardly compatible, something like Gears of War Judgment, what it would do is it would actually download a new version of Gears of War Judgment. What that means is that if at some point Microsoft decide to switch off those cloud servers and you've got an Xbox Series and you slide in Gears of War Judgment, for example, it's not going to play. It won't play it off the disk. It's not hardware-based backward compatibility, which, like when we talked about Xbox One games playing on the series and so on, is not like that. This is software emulation. This is server-side emulation, meaning that if you slide your Xbox 360 game into your Series X and your Series X isn't online or Microsoft has decided not to make that game compatible anymore, you won't be able to play it. It's not backwardly compatible in the pure sense. It's backwardly compatible as long as Microsoft allow you to make it backwardly compatible. As an aside, that's why some original Xbox games that play on the Xbox 360 using what we just talked about, which is hardware-based emulation unlocked with the right operating system, some of those games won't play on the Series X. You can slide in the original Xbox game, but it can't download a Series X version for it. So keep that in mind. Whilst original Xbox games, some of them, or quite a lot of them, will play on the 360, fewer of them will then play on the Xbox One or the Series X. And that's due to this server-side emulation problem. And the thing is, the ones that can play on the Series X can be switched off by Microsoft. Owning the disc doesn't mean shit, other than you got access to a license key. Looking at PlayStation, PS4 and PS5 do play some PS1 and PS2 games, but that's by software emulation. So, for example, on the PS5, you can buy Jack and Daxter, which is a PS2 game, and you can buy that game and you can play that game, and that's via emulation. You have to download it from the PS5 store. If you slide in your PS2 version of Jack and Daxter, your PS5 is not going to read it. This backward compatibility is reliant on software, and more importantly, if Sony switched off those server blades in their cloud, you would not be able to play this. On a similar note, the PS4 and the PS5 do play some PS3 games, but those are only available purely through cloud streaming. You can't even buy them and then download them off the cloud at Sony's behest, at their whim, and then play them forever as long as you want. They're only available on cloud streaming, and that's why there are some PS3 games like Resistance that were playable on the PS4 and PS5, and now they've been switched off because that cloud streaming option is not available anymore. This thing about software-based backward compatibility is really important to get into your head and really important to understand because once you realize this is the case, all of a sudden a lot of the backward compatibility that we've relied on suddenly becomes really clearly bullshit. Just to pause for a second and go back, like we said, hardware emulation is great. You have your console, like for example, you have your PS3, you get it out of the box, you plug it in, you put your PS1 game in it, and it plays your PS1 game. Fantastic. The same with the PS5 and the PS4 games, or the Series X and your Xbox One games. However, there are lots of different variations within that rely on, in a really broad way, the manufacturer, Sony or Microsoft, or even Nintendo or whoever, having data in the cloud they let you download so you can play a version of the game. And at any point, they can switch that off, which is the equivalent of them coming into your house and taking your disk off you. So a lot of backward compatibility people rely on, especially in the Xbox space, is reliant on Microsoft's goodwill. If, for example, Wayland Yutani take over Microsoft in 100 years' time and they've had to switch off all the Xbox games, you've lost all your backward compatibility. Remember that. That's a really interesting and important point when you're making your backward compatibility library and when you're making your retro game library. A lot of your backward compatibility doesn't mean shit that you've got the physical disc. The physical disc is just a license key. There are some occasions where licensing has gone missing. So, for example, if you have Mortal Kombat versus DC, you can no longer buy that on any of the Xbox systems at all. But if you put in your physical disc, you will then be able to play it by backward compatibility. But that's only because it will allow you to download all the patches and it'll allow you to download an Xbox Series compatible version of Mortal Kombat versus DC. You can't buy it, but in the background, that information is still in the cloud. But one day, that information might disappear. That's an important segue into another conversation, really, about physical versus digital. And people are very sort of rapidly, oh, physical is physical, it's amazing, or I love digital because it's really minimalist and I've got no footprint and it saves in storage and all this sorts of physical storage. The argument is nuanced. And I want you to think about it from your own perspective and your own values. A couple of things to point out are this: codes in a box, which you get quite a lot with Switch games and with some other consoles, are one-time use only access to a game. It's to a specific user account. So basically, if your grandma buys you a voucher and you use it to buy something, that's the same. If your grandmother buys you, like, I don't know, PlayStation Network credit and you use it to buy a game and it's on your account, that's the same as you going out and buying a game that's purely a download code or buying it purely digitally. If you buy a game that's a download code, at least you've got the box, which is nice, but the code itself is one-time use only. Not only can you not sell it on or transfer it, you can't actually share it with anyone else. It only belongs to your user account. So those immediately are two massive negatives about buying digital. That said, buying physical has got its own problems. So, for example, a lot of physical games now, not all by any means, but quite a lot of them, function as license keys, the same way that Nintendo Switch 2 game cards are. So, for example, if you were to buy Doom: The Dark Ages on Xbox Series, it's a disc and it's a box, and you slide it into your Xbox Series, but you cannot play it off the disc. It's only about 80 meg on there. That 80 meg is literally a license key so that you can download the 80 gig game from Microsoft servers. If Microsoft decided for whatever reason they were going to cancel Doom or they lost the license to Doom or something went wrong with Doom, they can just switch it off and that disc would just be a coaster. You won't be able to use it for anything. The benefit of buying something like a Nintendo Switch game card or a disc that literally just unlocks the download is that at least they're transferable. You can lend them to a friend of yours, or you can sell them secondhand and get some money back. There's another level of physical build which isn't quite as useless as the license code or unlock key, and that's physical builds that are basically pretty janky but essentially still work, but they require some pretty substantial patches. So, for example, the original Cyberpunk 2077, that was janky as hell, but you could sort of play it. Maybe that's not the best example, but there was lots of games which are janky, and then essentially once you buy them, you download the DLC, you download the patches, or the mandatory patches, and that's all good. Now, those physical games aren't perfect because, again, if you're still reliant on those patches being available in a cloud somewhere owned by Sony or owned by Microsoft or something like that. But again, you can sell those discs, you can lend them to your friends, and for now they work fine. But keep in mind, they don't work in a no internet ecosystem. You're relying on the goodwill of those server farms. The final point about physical stuff is that it has no DLC. Um, so often, if DLC is released after the physical release, you will have to go out and buy it anyway, unless it's free DLC, which is extremely rare. The important thing about this physical versus digital conversation is that all these things, codes in a box, license keys, janky builds, missing DLC, and even, all the Xbox backward compatibility talk they have, all that sort of stuff, it all relies on the same thing. It relies on servers staying up. These can go off. You only have to look at games like Ubisoft's The Crew, where they just decided one day to switch all the servers off and now they're getting sued about it, to see exactly what that means. Any company can just turn around and be like, we haven't got this anymore. If Sony go out of business, and keep in mind, Sony, whilst it's a big company, I mean, Microsoft could buy Sony. Like Microsoft is way bigger than Sony. Microsoft could buy Sony. Wayland Yutani could buy Sony. Anyone can buy Sony or Microsoft or Nintendo and switch off their servers. It's that simple. You're relying on their goodwill. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Do you trust them? That's entirely up to you. We'll talk about that more, like I say, in some later videos about backlog anxiety and about the future of my gaming here on this channel. A couple of minor things just to point out. Firstly, the Stop Killing Games initiative. This is a really interesting initiative. I recommend going on the website. They're essentially a lobby group that are lobbying that companies should not be allowed to switch off support for online games like, for example, The Crew. It's not quite the same as what I've just been talking about in terms of switching off or the risk of switching off patches and DLC and backward compatibility downloads and things like that, but it is adjacent to that. They do have a petition. They've gone to the EU, they've gone to the UK. They're trying to force it so that manufacturers allow users and members of the public to spend their own money to build like alternative servers and alternative mechanisms to keep the things alive. It's a really cool initiative. I don't think it's going to succeed at all, but nonetheless, it's worth checking out. A separate thing to look at here is the Does It Play website. This is a really interesting website and a really interesting initiative. They have a Patreon. I strongly recommend supporting them. You should follow them on Twitter as well. What they do is they check physical builds and they see whether or not those physical builds actually do play properly or whether or not they're unplayable without online downloads or patches or things like that. Really interesting website, really interesting work. I'd strongly recommend checking them out. And if you go through your library and trying to work out whether or not something actually is a physical build or whether or not it's something that has mandatory secret installs or things like that, this is a really good way to check that out. Um, I've used this to go through my library, and I actually did finish going through my library on this to work out whether or not there's any quote unquote physical games that I should just sell because frankly they're just not worth it. They're just license keys. Although that said, as I mentioned earlier, license keys do have their place. A quick thing to talk about here is streaming. I know a lot of people are really happy to do streaming on their own devices. So I bought a Logitech G Cloud, which is a very stream focusing device. And I know the PlayStation Portal is very much all about streaming, but it relies upon having really good internet. It involves having your internet really close by. And it's all about DRM content. So having content where you have the digital rights management for it. Um, in that sense, it's a lot like Netflix, where you've got to be buy your internet and have your Netflix account and so on and so forth, and you're at the behest of Netflix. This is completely different to local play. Local play is something you can be offline, you can be sitting on a beach, you can be in a park, you can do whatever you want for as long as you want, and you can just carry on playing your games. I know there are some offline options like Steam, for example, let you download games and then play them, but if you don't validate them by going back online within 30 days, it then locks you out of those games. And that happens a lot. Local play means that you own the things that you own. Speaking of Netflix, I think it's worth comparing Steam as a model and Netflix as a model because actually they're really, really similar. but they shouldn't be. So Netflix is a license to access Netflix. There's about 5,500 movies on Netflix right now. I'm in the UK, and that's pretty much what it is. And then there's about 10,000 TV shows on there. Now, the thing about Netflix is when you buy Netflix, you're paying a monthly subscription to access the front door of Netflix. It basically means you can wander in, look around, pick what you want off the shelf, and watch it. It's kind of like a virtual version of Blockbuster Video. That's what it was always billed to be. It's a license to access Netflix. The thing about Steam is that you don't pay a license to access Steam. Steam, you wander in and then you pick up stuff off the shelf and then you hold it locally in your device. Right, that sounds great, but the problem is Steam are only selling you licenses to that software. They can still take it off you. It's a different model to Netflix in the sense that if with Steam you were paying £10 a month or £20 a month or whatever, and then that meant that you went in and you could pick and play whatever you wanted for as long as you want, that would be a different psychological mindset. Netflix rather, remove games and TV shows all the time, and no one really complains because ultimately the thing about Netflix is you're paying the license to go into that ecosystem and play what you want. With Steam, you're paying for individual games. And when you're paying £10, £20, £30 for an individual game, you expect to be able to walk out of that virtual store with it and it is yours. Paying that full whack for it and then saying that they only let you play it for as long as they have the license for it, they can remove it from your Steam library. That's kind of bullshit. And again, that comes back to the whole thing about how when you're playing video games, especially when you're playing retro games, you look at backward compatibility, you want to own your game. You don't want to license it from someone. Speaking of Netflix, I'm a big fan of buying my own physical DVDs. I do that all the time. I buy my own physical DVDs and Blu-rays because ultimately I don't like the fact that Netflix can dictate what I watch by just removing stuff from streaming whenever they like. Do not be a slave to the subscription model. You should still own your own physical things. Or should you? What I'm showing you now is a picture of disc rot. Did you know that CDs, DVDs, Blu-ray discs can actually just rot over time like paper? If they're not stored properly, if you store them with strong chemicals or in damp environments or at the wrong temperature, over years, 10, 15, 20 years, they can start to fall apart and this can start to happen. And this can render them unusable. So on that basis, physical disks aren't going to last forever. A couple of points on the physical disk space. Older games are harder to find unscratched, I'll be honest. Trying to find a mint condition PS2 or PS1 game is tricky. PS3 games, for some reason, are always scratched as fuck, and I don't know why. That said, that doesn't really bother me when it comes to stuff like Xbox 360 because scratch discs still work because they only need to work as license keys. It doesn't matter if you've got a copy of Fallout 3 and it's really badly scratched. Once you slide it into your Series X, it just needs to recognize that it's an Xbox 360 version of Fallout 3, and then boom, it downloads the version that you need to actually play from the Series X. So in that sense, online backward compatibility that's server-side based is actually kind of a good thing. It's also worth noting that hardware degrades. Like nothing lasts. My PSP still works, which I'm absolutely astonished by, and so does my Nintendo DS. But come on, Game Boys, Game Boy Colors, Mega Drives, stuff starts to fall apart. Using your original hardware and using your original physical media for games like SNES cartridges, things like that, they will degrade. Nothing is going to last forever. On a long enough timeline, the life expectancy for everyone is zero. So at the end of the day, is it really worth having stuff physically? Is it really worth buying the hardware? We can just buy it online rather, and leapfrog from one generation to the next. It's worth thinking about. And finally, what I'm showing you on the screen here is some stuff from the Desert Play website. Long story short, read this at your own leisure and feel free to Google it as well. Even cartridges and recent cartridges, stuff like Switch games and Nintendo DS and 3DS, even they aren't as good, as robust as you might think. And this isn't a case of the diodes getting corroded or things like that. And it's not even a case of on cartridge batteries for local save files, like you used to get in Pokemon games or role playing games or things like that. It's not even a case of those eventually dying. Physical cartridges now need you to put them into the machine periodically and just boot them up. And the reason it needs that is to just kind of, well, it's very technical, I don't fully understand it, but to basically kind of like reset or reinvigorate that cartridge so that it stays live and decent and usable and playable. That means if you have a cartridge and you haven't put it in one of your physical systems for 10 years, it might not actually work anymore. Whereas if you had an identical cartridge and you put it in once a year and just literally switched it on, booted it up, got to the start screen and switched it off once a year for 10 years, it'll work perfectly. How weird is that? Physical cartridges need to be booted up to stay in good working physical order. And again, that's a demerit and a drawback to physical media. Is this something that you want to have to do all the time with all of your physical cartridges for all of your physical cartridge systems? It's worth thinking through, especially when we look at stuff like backward compatibility. I'm not going to come to any conclusions in this video because this video is long enough, but what I wanted to just highlight were all the various pros and cons of backward compatibility, streaming, local play, Steam versus Netflix, and especially there's nothing else you can take away from this is just the fact that a lot of the things that people refer to as, oh, this is amazing backward compatibility, PS4 plays PS2 games and Xbox Series can play Xbox 360 games. Those aren't real backward compatibility as far as I'm concerned. They're not hardware based, and obviously we've just talked about the flaws of relying on hardware. But the ones that we're talking about here, like 360 on Xbox Series X, those aren't hardware based. Those are server side software based. And as a result, they are contingent entirely on the goodwill of whoever owns the server farms that send this stuff down the internet to your house. Have a think about that. Are you happy with that being the case? Personally, I'm not. And that's a lot of what this retro emulation, especially the later videos we're going to be covering when we're looking at Generation 7 and Xbox and PS3 and things like that. That's what that's about. It's about not being a slave to the server farms and not being at the whim and behest of companies like Ubisoft, Sony, and Microsoft. Hopefully that was helpful. Please do leave any comments below if there's anything you want to add to the conversation or if there's anything that I got wrong or there's some new context that may have developed since this video launched. Otherwise, hopefully everyone, I will see you next time as this Emulation Retro Journey Chronicle continues. Stay classy.